Hi, welcome back to another video. This week we are taking a bit of a different direction as the medium is different and the subject matter is different than what we've thus far covered on my channel. We've mostly focused on oil paints and mostly portraiture except for that one small landscape study I did a few weeks back. This week, however, we're using water-based paints. There's been some questions and requests from some of you on trying to see if we can do demos and explaining differences and similarities between oil and water-based paints. This particular medium that I'm using this demo for is gouache or opaque watercolor, a medium that I've used extensively really for years, although not as much in the last few years. I'm going to try to cover in this relatively short video all the things that are pertinent with regards to using opaque watercolors, like tools and approaches, substrates, of course the advantages of water-based mediums over oils, and some of the challenges that they may potentially pose when you're comparing them to traditional oil-based paintings. If you are new to my channel, my name is Zoran, and I'm a professional artist based in Oakville, Canada, just outside of Toronto. On here we discuss all things art experimentation, mark making, different mediums. As I said, we've done mostly just oils thus far, but this is the first of hopefully many that I delve into water-based paints, so if you do find that of interest to you, do consider subscribing. Now on to the painting itself. What I'd like to sort of draw attention to initially was the drawing and the substrate. So if you've worked with any water-based paints, watercolor or gouache, opaque watercolor, which essentially is just highly pigmented watercolor, they use exactly the same binder, which is gum arabic, but gouache tends to be much more opaque. And this allows it, if you so wish, to be used much like oil paints in layering. You can certainly use it like watercolor. You can water it down and do wonderful little washes. As you can see, this initial stage, I've got it thinned down quite a lot, just sort of putting down some marks of interest. I'm obviously cognizant of the initial drawing, which was done, if you recall, from a few minutes ago, very intuitively. I'm just moving that pencil around, nothing really concrete. I've got a general idea of the design or what this is going to be, how the notan structure, which we covered in my last video, is going to sort of flow and appear on the final sort of finished work. And as you can see there in the bottom right, the majority of the foreground or the subject is in the top left corner. Everything else is negative space. We covered, as I said, that part of the foundation in the previous video. If you haven't seen it, I'll link it down below for you to go over that again. So in this initial stage, you got the sort of gestural quick little sketch that I did with a graphite pencil, which doesn't blend with water and is a good choice when making under drawings for these water-based mediums. So graphite, initial sketch, nothing really major, takes a minute or two for this particular piece. Sometimes it can be elaborate and can be part of your design. The substrate itself is something of note, however. So generally speaking, with water-based paints, gouache is no exception. You want to use high quality watercolor or mixed media paper, which essentially provides a stable surface that absorbs water without warping, which is definitely a concern. With gouache, as I said, you can layer and layer really well, i.e. you can put down a color and then put another one, as I am doing right there. As you can see, I put that blue underpainting. Now I'm sort of layering that background cityscape with another color, a bit thicker than the initial watered down version. So the substrate itself, as I said, in this case is a dye bond panel. Now I've used it previously on a couple of different videos on this channel. I haven't gone into detail as to what exactly that is. I hope to do that in future videos, but essentially it's just aluminum panel that's very rigid that can be prepared for oil paints, which I use quite often, but also for these types of sketches or paintings. Now, the reason for this is I like my surfaces to be not too absorbent. So watercolor paper as well as mixed media paper are generally very absorbent. I like, when working with gouache, opaque watercolor, oil, whatever, even acrylic, I like the paint to be malleable. I like to be able to move it around because I know the main obstacle when working with gouache are edges. Now I'll get to that in a moment. Essentially what happens is, and I've heard someone say this previously, main advantage of working with watercolor or gouache is that they dry quickly, and the main disadvantage, pardon me, is that they dry quickly. So what you end up having is a whole lot of edges, hard edges. Okay, so by having this substrate which received a single underpainting high cadmium yellow medium underpainting, which I'm now covering the background blue over it, you create a surface that's relatively slick. Now obviously it's still going to dry very quickly, but you can kind of manipulate the paint, which is very important when trying to create this painterly look and feel for a painting, especially if you're trying to make it look kind of like an oil painting and not like an illustration. Now gouache is a favorite for professional artists and illustrators, and it has been for years, simply for that reason. It's very versatile in that sense. You can lay down color, you can lay the next top coat over it without reconstituting or activating the below layer. Watercolor is a bit trickier in that sense, but gouache is certainly very versatile in that regard. If you watched my previous video on note 10 structure, you may recall that I promised you a photorealistic painting for this week. I apologize, it's taken a little longer to complete. I promise it's coming, but it might take a week or two longer just because the layering is taking a little longer to dry with oil paints. So stay tuned. And as you can see here, with regards to that layering process I talked about, firstly, I'm applying this gouache somewhat impasto-like. Now you can see these strokes that I'm making right now. They are somewhat chiseled. I'm using I think this is a 1/2 inch chiseled brush, and I am applying these planes, sort of different notes of color, much like I would an oil paint. Now this impasto-like feel and look of these brush marks will be somewhat toned down because as water dries, it pulls the pigment back down to the substrate, and the rigidity or the textural qualities of this initial look of the brush marks will kind of fade away or fade down, if you will, but the final look will look very similar to that. It just won't have that textural quality that oil paint has. As I lay down these subsequent layers in the background there, I want you to pay attention to the edges that are created. Every one of them is relatively hard, so that can be visually distracting unless that is something that you're after. Generally speaking, with these water-based mediums, what you can do is blend them by reconstituting or reactivating adjacent layers, so blending hard edges into more softer or disappearing edges. Or the way I do it, and I've covered this previously extensively on this channel, I use color values to shape form and to sort of knock back hard edges. Now that I've built up the background with various layers of paint, I'm introducing this new tool. to our repertoire. This is a hard pastel that you can certainly use at this stage or any stage of your painting, because obviously the nature of these water-based opaque watercolors, they dry very quickly. You don't have to follow any of these fat over lean principles that you have to, of course, with oil paints. I'm applying just marks of interest. I'm following some of the shapes of the ships and the background, but a lot of the marks are just somewhat intuitive and erratic. The intention really is just to create some variation of mark making and visual interest. Let me show you with another portrait I did in this style what that looks like up close. Here we have a portrait I did last year now, because it's 2025. This is a mixed media board that showcases up close for a portrait what interesting mark making may look like. And we'll see this when I zoom in on the final painting of that harbor. You can see a lot of the broken color, a lot of the layering of the gouache paint that I already discussed is visible there. You can see a lot of them actually visible or permeating through the subsequent layers. But what I more wanted to sort of show you here are those marks. You see all the lines, individual lines that were made in this case as well with hard pastels. You do not want to use soft pastels unless the board was prepared properly with some sort of a pastel gesso, or the paper is appropriate for soft pastels. But as I said, the interest is really what you're after. You're trying to create variation of line, variation of color, variation of marks to make it look visually appealing. For all of your opaque watercolor works, you should be putting it behind glass. Now, this particular portrait was done relatively recently, so I haven't had a chance to frame it, but because of the nature of gouache, it's less durable than oil, and it's prone to smudging, and of course you can reactivate color by touching it with something wet and thus damaging it or destroying it. So you should be putting it behind glass. You can of course also varnish it. So there's a whole lot of videos based around that topic. You can certainly find that, but you can't put a varnish on it. It will affect the color values, however. So be mindful of that. As I said, there's a bunch of content online you can find if you want to do that. Having said that, that leads me to another characteristic of gouache paint, and that is color values. And it's a relatively large disadvantage. If you are planning on working with them, you should know that when you put down a color value, it will shift. So there's a shift that happens from the point of you putting color down and to the point that it dries. So it usually has a tendency to go darker than how you apply. So as it dries, it will dry a couple of values darker, thus making it that much more difficult to gauge color values if you're trying to sort of copy a subject or be much more realistic or getting a much more realistic rendition. This can definitely be an obstacle, so just be aware of that. And if you are planning on varnishing your work, just be aware that the color values will shift darker as a result of that process. What will also happen is that you will have a relatively shinier finish, depending on, of course, what kind of varnish you put on. As I said, gouache paint is flat or just totally matte, and the varnishing process has a tendency to put a sort of like a polyurethane or shiny film on top, depending on what product you use. You should, of course, be spray varnishing initially, and then, of course, you can put a brush varnish on top of that. But as I said, there's a lot of content online you can find with regards to that process. Now, with regards to the paints themselves that I'm using here, these are Winsor & Newton's. If gouache, watercolor are daunting for you, or you've never worked with them and you'd like to try, I'd recommend that you get a cheap sort of box gouache set from Amazon or somewhere similar. You can probably get by with 30-40 bucks. There's a lot of what I think they're called jelly gouache, whatever. Until you figure out how they work, I recommend just playing around with those, getting proper substrates, however. Try to get good quality paper or something hard like a board or even canvas that's prepared properly. But the gouache themselves, try to save initially and then work your way up to something more expensive. As I said, these are Winsor & Newton. Uh, Daniel Smith has a great product. There's various brands, of course, that you can source, but initially try to see if you can get by on something less, cheaper, and then see if it works for you. Play around, make some marks, have fun with the medium, and see. You might be surprised. They certainly are different than oils. They, as I'm blending this foreground in, it's it's difficult to explain. I mean, I show this in workshops, but generally speaking, when I'm explaining it to people in video format, it's hard to explain. Sometimes they can be quite gummy, and they certainly don't flow as well as oils. So having your own set and playing around with it, making your mistakes. I keep repeating this. Just go out there and make your mistakes, and you'll learn a whole lot more than watching a video or having someone else do it. Now that we've basically covered the whole canvas with the appropriate color values, I felt that the work needed some more interest, some more interesting mark making, so I've introduced this 4-inch squeegee. It's a brass squeegee that I bought that I use a lot with oil paints. In oil paint, of course, I scrape paint off, apply paint with it, create very organic, sort of surprising marks. With this particular gouache painting, it was a bit more difficult. Initially what had happened was I took paint off of my palette, which is, by the way, one of those stay wet palettes. I didn't really get to talk about that yet, but initially I take paint off of that and I'm applying it very, very subtly on the surface with moderate success. So the reason I say moderate is that the marks themselves were okay, they just weren't as interesting to me as I had initially thought. So now I'm introducing again these hard pastels to add more interest in the background and the foreground and all over the place, just sort of working my way around all over the front, foreground, and the background, and to an extent the distant mountains there. The palette, as I said, is one of those stay wet palettes. My brand of palette is called Masterson, and they come in, I think, 2 sizes. Essentially what they allow you to do is mix your, both if you want to use acrylics or gouache or whatever water-based medium you're using, on them, on these stay wet papers that have like a sponge base, and for them to stay wet on that palette, not dry. Of course, they are going to be drying on the surface you're painting on, but you can mold and mix your paint on this palette for longer. It's an absolute must if you are going to be exploring this medium. Hopefully I've been able to pique your interest or open your eyes to this wonderful medium if you haven't previously known about it and how versatile it can be. There's, of course, a lot of limitations. It's just a matter of getting accustomed to them, figuring out what they're designed to do and how you can mold them and manipulate them to your liking. And in this case, use them like oil colors to make it look very painterly. or you can take another approach and make it look very washed, like a watercolor type of painting. It's quite a lot of fun to work with. The next few paintings over the next couple of weeks that I will introduce will go back to oils again, and they will of course be that photorealistic portrait, hopefully, that I promised you, as well as another one that's somewhat different than the previous ones. I think you'll enjoy them. As I zoom in on this finished gouache painting, you can hopefully see a lot of the marks that we talked about. Okay, so this is characteristic of a lot of my work, where I'm just trying to sort of play around like as if I was 15 years old again. I'm playing around with these colors. I'm putting down marks that I find enjoyable, visually pleasing. You can even see the underpainting, the yellow underpainting permeating through and kind of indicating sunset or sunrise. I don't know. Whatever it's sort of, whatever strikes your fancy. And as I zoom in here towards the bottom of the pane where you see a lot of the reflections, you can see some marks there as well. Some hard edges, some soft, but overall interesting little piece from, this is from our vacation in Croatia a few years back. And on this subject of edges, I've linked a video here at the end that really dives deeply into all facets of edges and how they're very important in your final work. Thank you very much for watching again and supporting the channel. I'll see you next week. Bye bye.